And it's my pleasure to introduce to you William G. Wong, the author of Sons of Chinatown, a memoir rooted in China and America, as well as Bruce Koon, who will be moderating tonight's conversation. So William G. Wong is a pioneering journalist and proud Cal alum, the son of a Chinese immigrant who arrived in Oakland's Chinatown during the Chinese exclusion era. Wong built a groundbreaking career at outlets like the San Francisco Chronicle, Wall Street Journal, and Oakland Tribune. His reporting has long centered Asian American voices, both in mainstream media and in independent publications. He's also the author of Yellow Journalist, Dispatches from Asian America, and Images of America, Oakland's Chinatown. Bruce Koon is the program coordinator for Contra Costa Youth Journalism and mentors students and mid-career journalists through initiatives like Pro News Coaches. He's also a senior fellow with the USC Center on Communication and Leadership Policy. A longtime Bay Area journalist, Bruce served as news director at KQED and held senior editorial roles with Knight Ritter's digital divisions. His reporting and editing career spans the San Francisco Chronicle, Oakland Tribune, and San Jose Mercury News. He is a founding board member and past president of the Online News Association and a former president of AAJA's San Francisco chapter. Bruce is also a Cal alum and former editor-in-chief of the Daily Californian. Finally, we'd like to thank the Cal Alumni Association Chinese chapter for their partnership and continuous support, and the Ethnic Studies Department for their support of this event as well. So please join me in giving me a warm welcome to our guest, William G. Wong.
I have the voice. Thank you very much for all coming out. I really appreciate seeing some old friends and some new friends too. I don't usually come up to the Cal campus, so it really is nostalgic for me to come back. The journalism school wasn't established when I was here. But let me add one item to the bio that Kobe gave. I was also the Daily Cal editor-in-chief 8 years before Bruce, all right? So that gives you some clue as to how young he is. Anyway, I am, how should I put this? I'm very pleased that I am a sliver of the resistance to what's coming out of Washington, D.C. these days on two topics, immigration and diversity. Sons of Chinatown is in a very quiet, low-key, but heartfelt way, pro-immigration and pro-diversity. And let me proceed with, if I can work this thing. Okay. The first topic is immigration. My father came in 1912 during the Chinese exclusion era, came to Oakland, went to Lincoln School. Then he went back to China 3 or 4 times, got married, had children, finally came in 1933. And let me see if I can do this. Here is his, Here is his paper father, alleged father. You see that? And here is my father's name, Xiao Hong Ji, and then it says son of a native here somewhere, right? So that was the category that would made him eligible to come in legally, even though he was using false papers. All right. So let me show you this. This was his paper father's, one of his documents. His name was Ji Bing Fong, I'll just GBF. And you notice the second name here is my father. So Ji Bing Fong said he was born in San Francisco, 1875, went back to China, with his parents, came back in 1895, and the ship captain said, now the Exclusion Act was in place, you cannot get off the ship because you are a subject of the Emperor of China. Well, he hired a lawyer, probably through one of the associations, and the U.S. District Judge, a white guy in San Francisco in about 1895, certified his native status. Therefore, he could bring in anyone or all of these children. And that made my father a son of a native. But here is a document I inherited from my father because I was using my journalism research to sort of either confirm or deny the assertions made in the immigration papers. And some of you may be able to, what I did was I had it translated, and here are the names of my father's real father, grandfather, and brother, and they are not GBF, all right? So here is a case where in journalism we say you're only as good as your sources. I would, for any of us, make sure your sources are reliable, all right? Now, here we're going to go into what I call, my book is also what I call an illegal immigration success story, all right? And the section here I'm going to get into is both the success story, which is not about me, but which is what our family, my father's children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, we are all acculturated and assimilated into America. We have not poisoned the blood of America. We are not vermins, but we are good people. And I got into a business that had very few people like me, and this is what I used in the newsroom at the Daily Cal and at my beginning job at the San Francisco Chronicle. And from that point on, I became a newspaper journalist, which, as we know, is maybe kind of like a dinosaur these days. But that is the story I'm going to tell about diversity, even though in the first 11 years of my journalism career, it was no big deal because I was one of the only, if one of the few Asian Chinese Americans in American newsrooms at the time. This is 1962 on, all right? And here at Cal, where I was, the Daily Cal, first I was a sports editor, but 2 or 3 months after I became sports editor, which I really loved, I became one of the people who got fired by the administration at the time because we endorsed a left-leaning student candidate for student government office, which was really a ripple effect of the Cold War. I'm not going to get into all those details because it gets very complicated, but I lost my standing at the Daily Cal, and it's still a memorable moment for me in 1960. But I became the Daily Cal editor in 1962. Now, I went on to a journalism career, and we're not supposed to be activists at all. And here is another example where I'm marrying my search for identity with my professional life. And I was one of the founders in 1977 of this group called Asians in Mass Media, which was a precursor to the Asian American Journalism Association. And I did this out of my house. We were activists in the sense that we wanted more jobs for people of Asian descent, and we wanted better coverage. And this was one of our vehicles to get the word out about trying to get interest in getting more people of Asian descent into journalism. And I love this one because I eventually ended up at the Oakland Tribune, and I was hired by Robert C. Maynard, a legendary African-American journalist with the Washington Post, who came west and left his job and he and his wife, Nancy Hicks, decided to start the Institute for Journalism Education to bring more people of color into a very vastly white profession. So I was with Bob, but he got ill. He needed to sell the paper because he became the owner of the paper. And the new owners of the paper were this Texas-based white chain that when they took over, they wanted an ad to tell their readership that everything would be the same. The people of Oakland who were majority minority would still get their voices heard because there would be me, Brenda Payton, and Mary Ellen Butler still there. This is the height of hypocrisy, but that's what we're about. Okay? Now, one of the proudest achievements of mine was in 1975. I'm not sure you can see the date. And the headline, I can't read from here, but you can read it maybe. It's one of the first opinion pieces denouncing anti-Asian racism in 1975 when the Vietnamese refugees who supported our war effort had to leave, coming to California. And when they came here, California and other places, they were met with anti-Asian hate. And I decided to educate the Wall Street Journal audience in 1975, when we were a blip on the radar screen in America, about the history of anti-Asian racism. I'm quite proud of this piece because, as I said, it was one of the earliest denunciations of that. And finally, I told you the new owners coming in, they said, diverse voices on the editorial pages would continue. Well, 3 or 4 years later, they decided they didn't want me. They downsized me and me only, and that was their reason. Economic downsizing. I happened to be the only person downsized. And you can tell by the headline that my firing by the Tribune in those days really lit a fuse in the community. I had, there were about 150 people who marched in front of the Tribune building in the rain, protesting my firing. Unfortunately, their pressure on the new management team at the Tribune in those days didn't do any good. And I had to quit the newsroom in those days. But I also saw at that time the direction that American print journalism was going in. And why don't we leave it there for that? And then Bruce and I will get together and he'll ask me some penetrating questions. So thank you for coming, and we'll do our best to answer your questions later. Thank you.
Okay. Hello. Oh, wow. I was sitting there, so I didn't get it, and I was riveted with the slideshow. So I didn't get to see the crowd, but it looks like we do have a good crowd here. The young gentleman who introduced us, did he have to run? Kobe, with a Y. Okay, well, thank you, Kobe. It's great to see the legacy continuing in many different ways. But I did want to thank, once again, as we did, the UC Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism for having us, the Ethnic Studies Department here at Cal, and the Chinese alumni chapter, I believe. We've met some of you outside. So thank you again. Repeat Bill's appreciation for you coming out. Bill, as you just heard, is a consummate journalist. And one of the things we always do is and we had a few conversations, is first of all, we want to know who our audience is. So how many have read the book already? Okay, so there's a few of you here. And Bill and I had a debate earlier because Bill, he wants the suspense of the book, so don't give any spoilers away. And I pointed out that the book has been out a while, there's been a lot of reviews, and we have an audience here tonight, we'll help them. So, and how many of you are immigrants? See, it's a trick question because technically we're all immigrants unless we're part of an indigenous group of Americans who are here. But let me rephrase that then. How many are first-generation Americans? Let me put it that way. Thank you. And I just before we got here, a gentleman.
Me too.
Okay, yeah, you as well. Let's see, I always get that a little confused. First generation, you were born here.
Yes.
Yeah, so, oh yeah, there's that aspect. If you were born here, you're first generation. So the second generation actually is you had to endure either this kind of travail or whatever. And I just heard a new term because we were sharing terms earlier. We are technically ABCs, American-born Chinese, as opposed to the former derogatory term FOB, fresh off the boat. And someone in the audience mentioned the new term, CBA. Have we heard this one? Okay.
Yeah, the person who said it.
Chinese-born Americans. In other words, you're born Chinese, but you became American. So, all right, enough of that background. And how many students do we have here, too? That's true. I know it would be hard to draw some of the students because you have AP tests going on this week, but thank you for coming as well. So, Bill, this book is described as a memoir. And even in the book cover itself says that, it's a memoir, and therefore it's really about your life, your family's life. And I wanted to explore with you how stories like this, which are very personal and intimate, but somehow manage to connect to larger issues, larger identification. And you already surprised me with your opening statement, because you never mentioned this to me before, but you said you consider your book a sliver of the resistance that's happening in America today regarding those two issues, immigration and diversity. And I want to get to that, but I want to start with, it's a personal book, but you spend, a good portion of the book on the history, in particular the Chinese immigration of the 19th century and the consequences into the 20th century. The Chinese Exclusion Act. Who in the room does not know what the Chinese Exclusion Act is? It's something that many of us as Chinese immigrants knew about, but you and I were at an event here in Berkeley not too long ago when a very esteemed person, you introduced yourself, you gave her a copy of the book, and you said it's about the Chinese Exclusion Act. I mean, it includes that. And she said, to my own embarrassment, I only found out about it recently. So why is that so important to you in writing this book?
Well, it took me a while, too, to learn about the Chinese Exclusion Act. When I was here at Cal, the political atmosphere was really around, as I said, a ripple effects of the Cold War and the beginnings of the civil rights movement that Martin Luther King had been starting even years before. So my knowledge of my own community's history took me a while to learn. So once I read about it, heard about it, and learned about it, I said, wow, because my parents did not communicate anything about their journey across the Pacific Ocean, the difficulties of going through Angel Island and the lengthy interrogations. So I was finally able, years before, to get transcripts of their interrogations, learned a great deal about whether or not the story they were telling was or was not true, as indicated by one of the slides. So I sort of took it upon myself as a matter of conscience to learn more about the Chinese Exclusion Act, to write about it within the historical context, because I've always been wondering why such a teeny part of the American population was excluded, and the time it was done, the Chinese population in America was well below 1% of the population. So in going back and learning about this, I said, I'm going to be writing marrying my identity search with my journalism training. So I was able to do that gradually at the Wall Street Journal first by having some front page stories with Asian American themes, which was highly unusual because in those days the Journal had 3 major stories on the front page 5 days a week. It's not like the New York Times or the Washington Post. Very valuable real estate. And I was able to propose some stories to the New York editors who said, yeah, go ahead and do this. So the one that I showed you was one, but I've done maybe a half a dozen others that were on the front page. And I wanted people to know that the Chinese immigrants and their children and grandchildren were a regular part of America. And it's not that big a deal today because we all know that. But it was really important for me to do historical context, cultural context to a country that presumably welcomes immigrants and allows us to achieve the American dream.
Now, that's an ambitious undertaking. I mentioned to a fellow reporter, former reporter here, I said, when are you going to write your book? And he said, I can't do that long form anymore. And, and I'm in awe of anyone who writes a book, and let alone their own family history. In fact, you undertook this in the beginning kind of casually in a kind of cavalier manner, and it sounded familiar because you said it was, the family kept talking about, well, who, about Pop and Grandpop, and, someone should sit down and get our family history down. And Bill is the journalist in the group, so why don't you do it? And that's what's the origin of the book in some ways?
Well, here in 2011, my wife and I host our family's Chinese New Year dinner, and I knew that 2012 would be the centennial, the 100th anniversary of my father coming from China to Oakland. So I said, my children and my nieces and nephews and their children do not know hardly anything about Pop, the founder of our Wong clan in Oakland, California. So I said, hey, I'm going to have the next year, I will have Pop's story for you, which was the dumbest thing I could say to my family, because as I got into the research, it got me deeper and deeper, and I said, I'm going to turn this from a family history into a larger story that then became the memoir, which was very difficult for a journalist to do because we usually are telling other people's stories. We go out, talk to people, whatever. It's very difficult. It was for me anyway to start talking about my story. Very reluctant to do it, but I ended up finally with, after multiple drafts, being able to tell my family story within the context of both Chinese history, as far as I knew it, and American history.
So along that lines of telling your own story and having been trained as a journalist who is a little detached from all that, your father's story ends up being pretty dramatic in many different ways. I mean, we have the criminality of, first of all, coming in illegally to this country. He was in many ways, as you said, illegal, which as a quick aside, it reminded me of the debates we were having in our newsroom about the importance of words and terms, because illegal was the accepted phrase for them.
Illegal aliens.
Yeah, illegal aliens. And, as some of the political movements and the awareness of immigration issues began to take hold, there were discussions in our newsrooms where some journalists would say, they're not illegal aliens, they just don't have papers, and hence the term undocumented was adopted by some papers and some news organizations as a more accurate way and a more neutral way to describe their status. there were a lot of places that still objected. Hey, that's the term. That's who they were. What's the big deal here? Did you ever run into those kind of issues in your career?
Not really. I think the let me raise this point. The term illegal is a very volatile term. It can turn people off. You are, quote, breaking a law. But I like people to think about why, maybe even today, maybe not today, after what the presidency and his South African immigrant friend are trying to do. There may be people rethinking wanting to come here, but I always thought that this was, in the Cantonese term, Gum San, meaning Gold Mountain, because it goes back to the gold rush where immigrants from my father's region came first to mine gold, and then later the railroad workers, Chinese Exclusion Act. But I like to think that we need to dig a little deeper into why people want to come to America. And shouldn't we be proud, again, pending the current situation, shouldn't we be proud that this is a place where people from all over the world have been coming, continue to want to come because they see a chance here to make a better living and maybe become more small d democratic and not members of an autocracy from which they're coming. So I never ran into that situation myself, but it took me a while to learn that my parents were legally illegal or legally illegal. Is that a term? I don't know. Yeah.
No. We'll send it out as a meme and see if it gets picked up. So along those lines, as you began to do your research and you discovered that not only were they here illegally or gained status illegally, but you discovered other criminality in your history. And again, in the context of the immigration experience, maybe not everyone views that as terrible because you have to feed your family, you have to make your way. But in truth, your father ran the numbers. He was a racket man. He was selling lottery tickets and doing all that kind of underhanded aspect. And there was gunfire, and there was a shooting, and maybe you wouldn't be here if, or at least the rest of your family wouldn't have been here had these things gone awry. Were you and your family, when you discovered these things, shocked or embarrassed, or how does one come to terms with, who we all are, and as you dig and discover?
No, my memory of knowing that my father was a lottery broker, second level, he wasn't a gambling boss. Just so that you know, in the 1930s, during the Depression, Oakland Chinatown, San Francisco Chinatown, a lot of the Chinatowns in California, their economic engine was selling lottery tickets, which were in those days illegal. But guess what? The political leaders, at least in Oakland and probably in other places, and the police department, both the higher and the beat cops, all knew this was going on. But guess what? Right? And there were fake raids or real raids that were previewed to the lottery sellers so that they could hide the goods or whatever. My father was raided several times, according to my sister, who worked as a young girl in the lottery shop. But as far as we were concerned, it was simply Pop's business. He had a grocery store, which was not a grocery store, and in the back were the places that people really wanted to go to because that's where you could get your ticket, all right? And in those days, Chinatown was abuzz 2 times a day, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, 9 o'clock at night, because that's when the winning tickets were drawn. So that's when people found out whether their a 5-spot, 10-spot would win a few bucks, right? So I don't want to go further into the spoiler as to why my father got into some trouble. You'll have to read the book about that. But it was really a traumatic, dramatic experience in our family's life. And after he got into that kind of trouble, by the way, he was a member of a Tong also, which also has a stereotypical reputation for being bad, versus the big organization in Chinatown was the Chinese Six Companies, or the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association, which means that the leaders of the good associations were also, some of them were leaders of the Tongs. So here you have, is it kind of a yin-yang thing? I don't know.
I don't know, Bill. There's a certain deniability you're trying to put in there. My dad was only the broker in the front office, not a gangster. But again,
well, let me interject this. A friend of mine who read the book said, a white woman, a good friend of mine, she said, "Bill, your dad was a gangster." I says, "Well, I guess he was."
Exactly. Well, I want to connect that to this earlier theme, as we said, because old stories, how do they relate to today and different generations? You have spoken to a number of groups, and they've come up. I've heard them come up to you, and when I'm describing your book, because I'm here to support you, to some of my friends who have children. Some of you do. And they say, "I want my children to read this book so they can understand what we went through, because they're not grateful or they don't understand, all of this history." But on the other hand, I mean, when you're a kid, you're, yeah, Dad, you're Mom, whatever. And you yourself, you said, growing up in Oakland Chinatown was a beautiful experience. It was this bubble of interest, excitement. It was protected. It was a good time.
Yes, it really was. When my sisters and I were growing up in Oakland Chinatown in the 30s and 40s, it was a very safe, secure place because there were so many other Chinese immigrant families doing what our family was doing, small businesses. So when we were hanging around the streets of Oakland Chinatown, if we did something slightly wrong, we knew that our parents would hear about it because the parents of other kids our age would see that. So it would be this very enclosed community, a village really, that was very safe. And frankly, I didn't feel any, quote, discrimination, even though later on we discovered that Chinatown was really a segregated community because Chinatown people, Chinese people, could not live and work outside of Chinatown. And I've heard stories of some of the more prominent leaders in Chinatown, all of them gambling bosses, by the way, having to use white friends to buy a home outside of Chinatown so that they could live in a better section of town, because Chinatown was always considered a down place.
In fact, just to jump back a moment, because again, going back to the Exclusion Act and your father's time and period, that was a fairly shameful period in American history, and along with the other stories we come along the way. And it was violent. There were lynchings. There were Chinatowns being burned down, just as we learned about the Black experience in the South, these aspects. Do you think your father knew and understood that when he was trying to make his way to the new country? And it would be in the 20s or the 30s?
I don't know for sure, but here's my theory. There was always a back and forth of Chinese men coming to America, seeking their gold, figuratively and literally, so that they could support their families in these poor villages, and eventually go back and build this towering building in their village to show their new status. So that was happening. So there would be a lot of exchanges, word of mouth, gossip about America being this place where you can make a lot of money. But my speculation and my kind of educated guess is that they were gilding the lily a little bit. They were kind of telling stories about how successful they were in America, when in fact a number of the men who came here did not find gold, had to work very hard, and it was somewhat shameful for them to admit to their village mates back home that they were not as wealthy as the gossip and the stories that some people were bringing back. So that's a reason why some of them decided to stay, do their best to start families here. And I'm happy that my father did it. And one of my sisters, she was born in China, 2 years old when she came. In her latter years, she lived in Sunnyvale. She told us in family gatherings she was so grateful that Pop came to America and brought them here, because she could not envision herself or our sisters doing as well in China. What we don't know, of course, what we didn't know then was when Pop and Mom came, China was in disarray, nothing like it is today. So if you're up on the news about where China is today, it's an amazing story that in my epilogue, I do some meditation about what kind of emotional linkage I and other Chinese Americans, especially American-born Chinese, should feel about our ancestral homeland.
Well, you do allude to that, and even the fact in your book you talk about later generations of Chinese Americans who come, because as you point out, the 19th century and our families were from a very small area to the south, the Guangdong province, Toisan, and today you have, even within our country, a wider diversity of Chinese Americans. The term even becomes more difficult. A friend was sharing her story to me that, we didn't care about the Northerners. The Han people were snobbish and they looked down on us, and we had the kind of prejudice that you found here. So how do you, I'd be willing to bet that a lot of the Cal students who are here today do have very different immigrant experiences now. So how does your story relate to them, or what do you have to tell them about your time?
Yeah. Wow. I look on the exclusion era Chinatown Cantonese Chinese who came from the Pearl River Delta, west of Hong Kong, west of Macau, as we are past our prime. We are smaller in number. Now, our children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren are thoroughly American. Whether or not they have an identity and a connection to the ancestral homeland is a good question that I don't have an answer for. But the newer group that came in after the 1965 liberalization of immigration laws and have been here now for several generations themselves, who are all over the place in Silicon Valley, in San Gabriel, maybe in other suburban neighborhoods, who are part of the professional class, who are scientific geniuses, who have invented AI chips, who did Zoom. All these people, and there are organizations such as the Committee of 100 and the United Chinese UCA or something like that, are very prominent. And some of us Chinatown Chinese sometimes say, boy, they don't know our struggles. And of course, we don't know theirs. So internally, intra-Chinese relationships are still a work in progress. We should know more about one another, have some empathy and sympathy for each other's stories. But here is where the difficulty in communications is. There may be a more heavily Mandarin-speaking group who do not really understand or tolerate Cantonese. And for those of us from the other smaller villages where my native dialect is, in the way I say it, Hoi San Hua, Taishanese, we don't communicate well with Cantonese speakers. So there's a huge difficulty of communicating in a Chinese language or dialect amongst one another, and there may be some intolerance for hearing the woes and pity stories from our generation versus the stories that are coming out of the newer generation. But what unites us now is the resurgence of anti-Asian hate and racism that the pandemic unleashed, and we should somehow have a way of learning from one another and being empathetic, and I hope that happens at some point. And my book, while it's about the Chinatown Chinese, and I wanted that story to be told in a very narrative way, because there is very little that's written about the exclusion era, Paper Sun, Angel Island experience. There are many, many wonderful writers and artists today of Chinese descent, of Asian descent, who are telling great stories, but I wanted to document the Chinatown experience during the exclusion era.
Great. We're going to come up with some questions, but I didn't get into your personal memoir part as much as I would have liked to. So read the book. But I would like you to read, as a closing moment, something you wrote, because I think it does capture a side of you that I've gotten to know more recently, where, again, there's a lot of emotion here that, yes, you should read this, that, the dispassion. Oh, that as a dispassionate journalist, we don't always allow ourselves and that voice to come out. And I was struck with these two paragraphs. And so start where it begins there. I was Chinese. You see that? Oh, yeah. So if you could read that down to the end. This is as close as I'm going to get to getting you out on this side.
Okay. I was Chinese in a Chinatown sense, but when I began to wiggle my way into white America, I sometimes felt ashamed of Pop and Chinatown because they didn't meet the white American standards of status and achievement. Those standards, of course, were set by white men with impressive means and unchallenged power. When some of my sisters started talking about a roots visit or a homecoming for two, since they were born there, I was interested in a dispassionate, almost clinical way. It might have been my professional mindset. During the 1980s and early 1990s, I was immersed in my newspaper journalism's career, quite a psychological distance from my Chinatown youth, but oddly physically close since I was then working for the Oakland Tribune, whose iconic tower was an easy 6-block walk from Chinatown's commercial core, my childhood home. At the same time, I was in the middle of an internalized search for my racial, ethnic, cultural identities, but wasn't ready to plunge into the deep waters of family history research?
Well, I'm very grateful that you did plunge because it's a compelling story on so many different levels. And I want to thank you. And we're going to go into our Q&A time. But first, a round of applause for our esteemed author and storyteller. And I told him that because we're going to be at UC Berkeley, that we should get a lot of provocative questions, So who's going to be first? Yes.
Hello. Thank you for being here. I noticed that you did your roots visit in 1994. That was 2 years before I was born. I was adopted from China. You also mentioned people with disabilities, so thank you for that too. Since you went in 1994 and the 90s were just kind of a very historical period because it's at a time when there was the one-child policy and international adoption was going on. How has that phenomenon kind of how have you thought about it in relation to your own history?
Not really, because the trip was something that my sisters and I had talked about as early as 1989, but we know what happened in 1989, Tiananmen Square. We decided that wasn't the time to go, so some of us finally got around to saying we wanted simply to find Pop's village, because we didn't know much about his China experience, and I'm not the only one among my siblings, 6 older sisters, who were questioning their own identity, especially the 4 who were born in Oakland, all right? The 3 China-born sisters were relatively less interested in going back to the village where they were born. So the question of adoption, one-child policy really didn't come up for us because we were simply interested in touching the soil from which our clan leader came from, which would give us some idea. But this was before I engaged in family history research, because I went again in 2014 with then my son, who's only half Chinese, and we went back to the village for research only, and I got some doozy stories from 2 men who were not alive when my father was, but my father's reputation, because he had sent money back, he was considered a big deal in his village. They heard about his reputation and told me some stories that I'm glad I heard, even though they're kind of gossip. I use them, and in my book, they're the truth. That's what a memoir is.
Just a simple one. Can you explain your double last name, G and Wong?
Simple question, complicated answer. Having to do with my mother's immigration in 1933, my mother is the second wife of my father. The first wife, we are told, died. We have no certainty about that, but let's say it's true. The second wife was from the same village as the first. So the first wife gave birth to 1 daughter, Lai Hong. The second wife, my eventual mother, gave birth to 5 daughters and me. 2 of the daughters, daughter number 2, daughter number 3, born in China. They came in as G's, their family name. But my mother, on that list of fake children, the only girl on there was her. So somebody bought that slot for my mother, but she was a sister of my father on paper. Okay? Now that's why it's not an easy answer. So she came in as a G single woman. But when they got to Oakland, and I love the timeline, they got to Oakland in late November of 1933. She learned that she became pregnant in December of 1933. Scandal. How could a single woman, Chinatown knew, the outside world, because officially she was a single woman, the sister of the man who was really her husband. So on February the 14th, and I should have probably included this slide, a marriage certificate dated February the 14th, 1934. Ji Siu Kui, her name, marrying Wong Sheng. Who was this Wong Sheng guy? He was given some money to, quote, marry my mother on paper. And I have the marriage certificate and other documents from Alameda County, all in English, saying that Wong Sheng married Ji Siu Kui and therefore legitimized the birth in September of 1994, my first Oakland-born sister, a name you may know, a well-known political activist, poet named Nellie Wong. All right? Nellie came in 1934. Leslie came in 1936. Flo Oi Wong, another poet and artist, came in 1938. And the only boy came in 1941. The 4 Oakland-born children are surnamed Wong. The 3 China-born sisters are surnamed Ji, but we're all in the same line. So in Chinatown, people said, no big deal, because we have other stories to tell you about how we got around the Chinese Exclusion Act. But to the schools and City Hall and anybody else in the white world, or the white-dominated world, we were Wongs, and my older sisters were G's, but we all, in Chinatown, we were all G's. Now, when I began writing at the Oakland Tribune, it was either Bill Wong or William Wong. So I decided after doing research to legally add to my name my father's true surname to do honor to him and to the truth, right? So I struggled with whether I should be William Wong G, William G hyphen Wong, or, all of that. So I decided to do it the way the book cover has it, because had I not been writing professionally under William Wong, I would have quickly probably dropped the Wong and do William G. So I don't know whether that answers your question, because it's a sense of the complications that many families had to go through to make their status in America as legal as possible, okay? And I hope that Trump and Musk aren't going to send ICE into this room and deport me to Venezuela.
The back, or there, and then the back.
Oh, thank you. Are your research materials going to be archived somewhere? Because I'd really like to read the interview you did with a family friend who is this very distinguished person, upper middle class, that I learned in your book ran numbers as a youth.
Who is that person?
Oh, Calvin Wong.
Oh, Calvin. Oh, my God. Yeah. It happens that I have my papers, boxes of them, at the Ethnic Studies Library. I have not yet donated boxes more that have Sons of Chinatown research. I'm glad you asked, because I need to learn the librarian's name, because I soon want to donate those boxes.
And
Calvin Wong. Wow.
Yeah, but we passed the immunity. What is it? The after 7 years, you're not liable for that crime anymore.
Right.
So we're protected here. I think there's a question in the back there.
All right, thank you. And I have two questions, and it's a fascinating share. So the first question, of course, is a more technical question. And so thank you for being so honest by saying that you use the gossip as a material and treat it as a truth. So my question is, to what extent do you use gossip as the material or the true material? Or if you do fact check, what are the main methods that you do fact check your family story?
Well, I have some Chinese language documents. I have my father's family tree book, genealogy book, Jiapu. Yep. Okay, and I had it translated, and that's where I confirmed that my father's parents were who were on that document that I showed in the slide. Back to the gossip thing, it's true. I don't want to go into great detail about what these two village men in 2014 who knew of my father's reputation told me, because there was no way for me then to, what is the term, impeach their storytelling, because they were telling me their, it was kind of like talk story in the Hawaiian sense. You tell stories and they become, you tell it generation to generation, and who knows whether it becomes a version of telephone, that you tell one person and suddenly it changes a little bit. Anyway, there was no way for me to confirm those stories, so I put into the book their gossip, as I said, but I'm willing to accept that as a matter of truth, because what they told me essentially made sense why my father brought his family over in 1933 rather than to do what he might have intended early in his stay, to go back to China and settle there.
Right, thank you. And the second question is more of a personal history kind of a question. So what's your earliest recollection of your Chinese identity narrative growing up in your family, in Chinatown, and in a wider American? Like the example is for example, we hear stories like Chinese people come here to after a better life, or we built the railway, so we need to claim a piece of this country. What's the narrative, or the victim? What's the narrative that you grew up with?
Well, as I indicated early, my Chinatown experience was safe, secure. I didn't think of any Chinese identity questions at all, because I was surrounded by people who were like me, even though the school I went to, Lincoln, had probably a majority of Chinese students, but also white. Some, in those days, we called Mexican students, maybe a few black students. So there was always in Chinatown people like me who spoke this trifecta Chinglish, Hoisanwa, Cantonese, and English. And we would weave in and out, and we would sort of know what we were talking about. And when we went to Chinese school, we would learn in Cantonese, except on Saturday we would learn in Mandarin. So my identity it was just Chinatown. I'm here in Chinatown. I'm with my family. And it wasn't the identity, the racial ethnic identity was, believe me, no big deal when I was growing up in the 40s and 50s. And for most of us, except if you're African American and you were part of the legacy of slavery, most of us probably didn't think much about our ethnic identity. It's a question we might ask of Italian immigrants, Irish immigrants, German immigrants, Dutch immigrants. When did they start losing their white ethnic identity and their language and their culture and simply become Americans? It was a lot harder for people of my background, Chinese, because there's been a long history of anti-Chinese racism that goes back even before the gold rush, because there was a book called The Unwelcome Immigrant by, I think, a scholar here at Cal, or at least the publisher of the book in the 1960s, which I urge you to Google and look up, because it told stories about anti-Chinese feelings before there were hardly any Chinese in America.
Could I ask you, that first question was very intriguing. Are you a journalism student, or what was behind that question of truth and gossip?
Oh, I used to be a journalist. Well, I'm still doing bits and that journalistic work, but been a long time.
Because we were hoping we'd get into a whole thing about truth and gossip, but that'll be for another session. Is there time for one more question? Just we want to be sure we covered everybody.
Yeah.
There is? And we have one. All right.
I think earlier in this conversation, you talked about how you did roughly half a dozen front page stories for the Wall Street Journal covering Asian American themes. I'm curious at the time if that felt like you were doing something groundbreaking or if it just felt natural to you. Yeah.
No, at that time, my racial ethnic consciousness was high enough because I had remember when that began in the late 60s with the Third World Strike stuff happening here at Cal and at San Francisco State, the beginnings of the ethnic studies movement, which was a ripple effect of the civil rights movement. And even before that, when I was here, the free speech movement. So by that time, I wanted to, as I said earlier, marry my identity search, which is still going on in some ways, to my professional journalism training. And I certainly learned how to write for the Wall Street Journal front page features on the column 1, column 6, and in the middle, the A-head column, precious real estate for any reporter from the Wall Street Journal. But I also wanted to, because at that time, the diplomatic relationships between America and China were just beginning, and I knew that there were some good stories that could be told in addition to the opinion column that I referenced in the slide. There was the Labor Day weekend of 1977, the Golden Dragon Massacre in San Francisco, Chinatown, a gang war between FOBs and ABCs where, 5 people were killed and a dozen people were injured, none of the gang members. Big coverage of that. So I was at the Wall Street Journal in San Francisco. Wall Street Journal in San Francisco doesn't do local crime stories. So I cogitated for a long time, how could I come up with a story that be worthy of Wall Street Journal front page standards that I could use to explain and give people some idea of what was behind that gang violence in San Francisco, Chinatown. And I put it back to the Chinese Exclusion Act and all the psychological and physiological implications for those of us who grew up in that era.
Getting on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, a story was very, very competitive, and so that's a great achievement. I want to thank you all. I understand that Bill would be available to talk more and sign books. You've been a great audience. We hope we have informed and enlightened. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes.
Well done.